On a frigid December morning in 2023, a small church in rural Saskatchewan held its final Christmas service. The pews, once packed with three generations of the same families, now echoed with the voices of just seven elderly parishioners. Pastor Margaret Thompson, whose grandfather had built this church with his own hands in 1923, locked the doors for the last time as snow began to fall. What she didn't know was that she was witnessing a moment that would soon define the future of faith across an entire continent. The numbers are staggering. In 1971, nearly 90% of Canadians identified as Christian. Today, that figure has plummeted to just over 50%, with some provinces seeing even more dramatic declines. But this isn't just a Canadian story, it's a preview of what's coming south of the border, where American religious leaders are watching with a mixture of fascination and dread. The transformation began quietly in the 1960s, when Pierre Trudeau's government started dismantling the unofficial Protestant establishment that had dominated Canadian public life since Confederation. The Quebec Quiet Revolution had already shaken the Catholic Church's grip on French Canada, but what happened next caught everyone off guard. Instead of simply switching denominations, Canadians began abandoning organized religion altogether at a pace that stunned sociologists. Dr. Sarah Wilkins Laflamme at the University of Waterloo has spent the last decade tracking this phenomenon. Her research reveals something remarkable. The collapse of Canadian Christianity isn't primarily due to immigration from non-Christian countries, as many assume. Instead, it's driven by what she calls the Great Abandonment. Millions of Canadians raised in Christian households who simply walked away from faith entirely. The city of Vancouver provides perhaps the most dramatic example. Once known as the City of Churches, Vancouver today has one of the lowest church attendance rates in North America. Drive through neighborhoods like Gate-Solano or Commercial Drive, and you'll see former churches converted into condominiums, community centers, and even cannabis dispensaries. The irony isn't lost on longtime residents who remember when these same buildings anchored community life. But here's where the story takes an unexpected turn. While traditional Christianity crumbles, something else is rising from its ashes. Indigenous spirituality, once brutally suppressed by Canadian churches, is experiencing an unprecedented revival. Smudging ceremonies are becoming common in government buildings. Traditional healing practices are being integrated into healthcare systems. The very institutions that once sought to eliminate Indigenous faith are now embracing it as part of Canada's spiritual future. The generational divide is perhaps most visible in the data. Among Canadians over 65, nearly 70% still identify as Christian. Among those under 35, that number drops to just 34%. This isn't a gradual shift. It's a demographic cliff that religious institutions are tumbling over at breakneck speed. Welcome to Professor Archive, where we dive deep into the stories that shape our world. I'm fascinated to know, where are you watching this from and what time of day is it for you? Are you someone who grew up in a religious household or did you come from a more secular background? Drop a comment and let me know because understanding your perspective helps me tell these stories better. The parallels to American trends are impossible to ignore. The Pew Research Center's latest data shows that American Christianity is declining at nearly the same rate Canada's did 20 years ago. Church membership in the United States has fallen below 50% for the first time in recorded history. The so-called knowns, people claiming no religious affiliation, now represent the fastest-growing religious category in America. But Canada's experience offers a glimpse into what this transformation actually looks like on the ground. Take the story of Timothy Chen, a third-generation Chinese Canadian whose family attended the same United Church in Toronto for decades. His grandparents found community and support there during the difficult years of Canadian exclusion laws. His parents met in the church youth group and were married by the same pastor who baptized Timothy. Yet, when Timothy's own children came of age, the church felt foreign to them. The hymns seemed outdated, the theology irrelevant to their daily struggles with climate change, social justice, and economic uncertainty. The final straw came when the congregation split over same-sex marriage, despite Canada legalizing it nationally in 2005. Timothy's family simply stopped attending, joining millions of other Canadians who drifted away not in anger, but in indifference. This indifference, researchers argue, is what makes the Canadian model so unsettling for American religious leaders. It's one thing to lose believers to other faiths or to secularist movements with clear ideological opposition to religion. It's quite another to watch them simply lose interest, treating faith as irrelevant rather than wrong. The economic implications are staggering. The United Church of Canada, once the country's largest Protestant denomination, has sold hundreds of properties in the last decade. The Anglican Church faces similar pressures, with some dioceses selling historic cathedrals to stay financially afloat. These aren't just buildings, they're repositories of Canadian cultural memory, and their loss marks a fundamental shift in how communities understand themselves. Yet, something unexpected is happening in the spaces where traditional religion once dominated. Community gardens are sprouting in former church parking lots. Secular meditation groups meet in rented church basements. Food banks, originally run by religious organizations, continue operating under purely humanitarian mandates. The social infrastructure that churches once provided hasn't disappeared. It's simply been secularized. The most intriguing development might be what sociologists call spiritual but not religious Canadians. These individuals, representing nearly 20% of the population, maintain belief in some form of spirituality while rejecting organized religion entirely. They're creating new forms of community around mindfulness, environmental activism, and personal growth that bear little resemblance to traditional religious practice. Dr. Linda Woodhead from King's College London has studied this phenomenon extensively. She argues that we're witnessing not the death of spirituality, but its liberation from institutional control. Young Canadians are assembling their own belief systems from various traditions. A bit of Buddhism here, some indigenous wisdom there, perhaps some Christian ethics filtered through a social justice lens. The political implications are equally profound. The religious right, which wields enormous influence in American politics, has virtually no equivalent in Canada. Conservative politicians who appeal to evangelical voters south of the border find little traction in a country where such voters represent a shrinking minority. This shift has pushed Canadian politics decidedly leftward on social issues, creating an ever-widening gap with American political culture. Perhaps nowhere is this more evident than in Quebec, where the Catholic Church's influence was so complete that the province was once known as priest-ridden. Today, Quebec has some of the most progressive social policies in North America, from subsidized daycare to assisted dying legislation. The transformation from theocracy to secular liberalism happened in just 2 generations. But the most surprising aspect of Canada's religious decline might be how peaceful it's been. Unlike France's bitter struggles over laïcité or the culture wars raging in the United States, Canada's secularization has proceeded with remarkable civility. Former believers don't rail against their abandoned faiths. They simply move on. This civility extends to how remaining religious communities are treated. While church attendance plummets, Canadians remain broadly tolerant of religious expression. Sikh RCMP officers wear turbans, Muslim women serve in parliament while wearing hijabs, and Jewish schools receive public funding in several provinces. The decline of Christianity hasn't produced hostility toward religion generally, but rather indifference to its public role. American religious leaders studying the Canadian model face an uncomfortable question. Is this tolerance actually more threatening than outright hostility? A society that actively opposes religion at least takes it seriously. A society that simply ignores it suggests something far more profound, that religion has become culturally irrelevant. The demographic data suggests this transformation is accelerating. Immigration patterns that once brought religious families to Canada are shifting towards secular or nominally religious individuals from countries like China and India. Birth rates among religious families are declining toward the national average. Even accounting for religious revival movements, the mathematical trajectory seems irreversible. Yet some communities are bucking the trend. Indigenous populations, after centuries of forced assimilation, are reclaiming traditional spiritual practices with remarkable success. Muslim communities, while small, show strong religious retention rates among younger generations. Certain evangelical and Pentecostal churches continue growing, though not fast enough to offset broader declines. The technology sector offers another fascinating case study. Vancouver and Toronto have become major tech hubs, attracting young professionals from around the world. These individuals tend to be highly educated, cosmopolitan, and secular. They're creating new forms of community around shared interests and values rather than inherited traditions. Their influence on Canadian culture far exceeds their numbers. If you're finding this deep dive into Canada's religious transformation as fascinating as I am, consider supporting the channel with a super thanks. Your support helps me research and produce more content like this, and I'm genuinely grateful for everyone who chooses to contribute. The implications for American Christianity are sobering. Every trend that reshaped Canadian religious life, urbanization, higher education, cultural pluralism, generational change, is accelerating in the United States. The same social forces that emptied Canadian churches are now at work south of the border, just a generation behind. American evangelical leaders have begun studying the Canadian experience with increasing urgency. Some propose doubling down on cultural resistance, hoping to maintain religious communities through isolation from secular influences. Others advocate for adaptation, seeking to make Christianity more relevant to contemporary concerns. A few, like Pastor Rob Bell, have embraced radical theological innovation that would have been unthinkable a generation ago. The Catholic Church faces perhaps the greatest challenge. In Quebec, church attendance among Catholics has fallen to below 5%, devastating one of North America's oldest Catholic cultures. American Catholics are watching this collapse with alarm, knowing that Latino immigration has masked similar trends in their own communities. Protestant denominations are experimenting with new models. Some are embracing progressive theology and social activism, hoping to attract younger members concerned about climate change and social justice. Others are maintaining traditional teachings while modernizing their approach to community building and worship styles. The results have been mixed at best. Perhaps the most significant lesson from the Canadian experience is that religious decline, once it reaches a tipping point, becomes self-reinforcing. As churches close and religious communities shrink, the social pressure to maintain religious identity disappears. Children grow up without religious friends, religious role models, or religious cultural touchstones. Faith becomes not wrong or bad, but simply foreign. This creates what sociologists call a secular spiral. Each generation becomes more secular than the last, not through conscious rejection of religion, but through simple lack of exposure. Breaking this spiral requires extraordinary effort, and very few societies have managed it once the process begins. The economic ramifications extend far beyond religious institutions themselves. In many American communities, churches are among the largest property owners and employers. Their decline would leave massive holes in local economies and social services. The volunteer networks that religious organizations coordinate represent billions of dollars in unpaid labor that would be difficult to replace. Yet Canada's experience also suggests that societies can function perfectly well without strong religious institutions. Crime rates haven't increased. Social cohesion remains strong in most communities. Charitable giving has shifted towards secular organizations but hasn't dramatically declined. The apocalyptic scenarios that some American religious leaders paint simply haven't materialized north of the border. The most profound change might be in how Canadians think about meaning and purpose. Traditional religions offered comprehensive worldviews that explained suffering, provided moral guidance, and promised ultimate meaning. Secular Canadians have had to construct these frameworks for themselves, drawing from philosophy, science, art, and personal experience. This individualization of meaning-making has both benefits and costs. It allows for greater personal freedom and authenticity, but it also increases the burden on individuals to create their own sense of purpose. Mental health challenges among young Canadians have risen alongside religious decline, though causation remains unclear. The environmental movement has emerged as something of a secular religion for many Canadians, providing both community and transcendent purpose. Climate activism offers moral certainty, ritual practice, and hope for redemption that bear striking resemblances to traditional religious experience. Some scholars argue that environmentalism is filling the spiritual void left by Christianity's retreat. Technology plays an increasingly important role in how Canadians construct meaning and community. Online forums, social media groups, and virtual reality experiences create new forms of collective identity and shared purpose. These digital communities often exhibit characteristics traditionally associated with religious organizations: shared beliefs, ritual practices, and strong emotional bonds. The global implications of the Canadian model extend far beyond North America. European countries are experiencing similar trends, while parts of Asia and Africa are seeing religious revival. Understanding how different societies navigate the relationship between modernity and faith has become crucial for predicting global political and cultural developments. China presents perhaps the most interesting comparison. Like Canada, China experienced a systematic dismantling of traditional religious institutions. Unlike Canada, this happened through state coercion rather than social evolution. The Chinese government now faces the challenge of managing spiritual hunger in a officially secular society, leading to careful accommodation of certain religious practices while maintaining strict control over religious institutions. The Nordic countries offer another model, where state churches have been largely abandoned but continue to exist as cultural institutions. Most Scandinavians are technically Lutheran, but rarely attend services except for major life events. This cultural Christianity allows societies to maintain some connection to religious tradition while functioning as essentially secular states. Canada's path has been different: less state involvement than in Scandinavia, less cultural preservation than in Nordic countries, but also less conflict than in France or the United States. This managed decline of religious influence might represent a new model for how diverse societies can navigate religious change without social upheaval. The question that haunts American observers is whether their society can manage a similar transition. The United States has always been more religious than Canada, with stronger evangelical movements, more political involvement by religious groups, and deeper integration between faith and national identity. The cultural and political battles surrounding religious decline are likely to be more intense south of the border. Recent Supreme Court decisions on religious freedom, school prayer, and abortion suggest that American religious communities are preparing to fight for their influence rather than accept gradual marginalization. This resistance could delay secularization but might also make the eventual transition more traumatic. The generational divide that defines Canadian religious change is accelerating in America. Young Americans are leaving religious institutions at unprecedented rates, citing conflicts between traditional teachings and their values on issues like LGBTQ+ rights, women's equality, and social justice. Unlike their Canadian counterparts, however, they face stronger family and community pressure to maintain religious identity. Regional differences within both countries add complexity to these trends. Rural areas in both Canada and the United States maintain stronger religious cultures than urban centers. However, even rural communities are experiencing change as young people migrate to cities and return with different values and perspectives. Indigenous communities on both sides of the border are experiencing religious revival, but of traditional practices rather than Christianity. This represents a remarkable historical reversal. The very groups that missionaries worked to convert are now leading the rejection of Christian influence, while reclaiming spiritual practices that many assumed were lost forever. The role of education in driving religious change cannot be overstated. University attendance rates have soared in both countries, and higher education strongly correlates with religious doubt. Canadian universities embraced secular perspectives earlier and more thoroughly than many American institutions, accelerating the country's religious transition. Immigration patterns also differ significantly between the two countries. Canada has actively recruited highly educated immigrants who tend to be secular or nominally religious. The United States has seen more religious immigration, particularly from Latin America and parts of Asia and Africa, where traditional Christianity remains strong. These demographic trends suggest that American religious decline might follow a different pattern than Canada's. Rather than uniform secularization, the United States might see the emergence of distinct religious and secular regions, potentially increasing political polarization along religious lines. The economic implications of religious decline extend into unexpected areas. Religious tourism, a significant industry in many American communities, could face challenges as domestic religious interest wanes. Religious publishing, broadcasting, and education represent billions of dollars in economic activity that might need to find new markets or purposes. Perhaps most importantly, the Canadian experience suggests that religious decline is not necessarily reversible through traditional methods. Revival movements that worked in the past seem less effective in societies that have moved beyond the cultural Christianity phase. New approaches to faith and community are needed, but their success remains uncertain. As we watch these transformations unfold, it's worth remembering that we're witnessing one of the most significant cultural shifts in centuries. The role of religion in human society has been relatively stable for millennia. What's happening in Canada and potentially in the United States represents uncharted territory for how complex societies organize meaning, morality, and community. The story of Pastor Margaret Thompson's church closure that opened our journey isn't just about one building or one community. It's about the end of an era when religious institutions could assume their central place in community life. What emerges from this transformation will shape the future of North American society in ways we're only beginning to understand. Whether you see this change as liberation from outdated institutions or as the loss of humanity's spiritual foundation probably depends on your own relationship with faith. But regardless of your perspective, the Canadian model offers a compelling preview of what post-Christian society might actually look like. And for Americans watching nervously from the South, that preview is both more mundane and more profound than anyone expected. Thank you for joining me on this exploration of one of the most significant cultural transformations of our time. If this content resonated with you, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. And if you'd like to support more deep dives like this one, consider subscribing and hitting that notification bell. Until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, and keep seeking the stories that help us understand our changing world.